Okay, so good evening all. It's Dvora Kresniansky here from Adai. And tonight we're doing a webinar with Shalom Task Force, Avital Levin, who is the Education Director at Shalom Task Force. And tonight is part 2 in our series about the community having power to address abuse, to end abuse, to help those victims in abuse. And last week, a couple weeks ago, we spoke with Dr. Shana Friedman about what is abuse. And today, in part 2, Avital Levin will be talking about what we can do, how we can be supportive of those who are in an abusive situation. But before we get into that, Avital, can we talk a little bit about the work of Shalom Task Force and how they help the community, and then what you do specifically, because I think it's great what you're doing for the community.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for having me tonight, Dvora. It's been great to collaborate for the past few years, doing programs together. And I recently looked on Adai's website, and I was so impressed with just the wealth of education, awareness, and information that is there for people to be able to access. So thank you for including us. So Shalom Task Force, the organization, was started about 27 years ago when actually a pediatrician in the Long Island community noticed that many of the mothers and children who he was treating in his practice had bruises. And this was an Orthodox Jewish pediatrician treating mostly, Orthodox Jewish clients, patients, and he recognized that there was a real issue of domestic abuse in the frum community. At that time, there were limited resources. In general, awareness then was much, it was different than what it was today. It was certainly many years before the Me Too movement, many years before there was more of a public awareness and willingness to recognize that abuse is something that exists inside people's homes. So he approached a few active members of the community, and Shalom Task Force started. The organization started primarily with a hotline, which to this day continues to be a really vital resource for so many members of the community. Our confidential anonymous hotline receives calls. We have about 65 trained hotline advocates who take calls. And when people ask who calls our hotline, so really it's everyone. It's individuals who themselves are in an abusive relationship and are seeking support, as well as family members or friends or neighbors, or sometimes community leaders who reach out looking to receive advice or support or resources on how to best support the person who they suspect or are aware of as being in a domestic abuse relationship. And that's the topic for tonight, Dvora, that we'll speak more about how to support others in an abusive relationship. We get calls from men, we get calls from women, and most recently, actually, over the past few months during COVID, we were finally able to launch our chat line, which is an amazing resource. It's the same phone number as the Shalom Task Force hotline, and it offers the ability for people to be able to chat in. So you can text that phone number, you can WhatsApp our number, maybe in a couple minutes, Dvora, if we want to put the hotline number on the chat. People can also look us up just by Googling Shalom Task Force or going to the shalomtaskforce.org website. So we have that chat line now, and people are able to reach out to our chat with questions as well. We really encourage people to reach out during dating, during engagement, of course, marriage, with questions related to relationships, and if there are any concerns of red flags or concerns about something that is going on in the relationship that perhaps feels abusive, to reach out to the hotline, and we're able to support you in that way. Connected to our hotline, we have a legal department. So Shalom Task Force has a team of attorneys who represent victims of domestic abuse pro bono. So we're able to take on the case of somebody who is either has limited access to finances, which is so often the case, where if there's a situation of financial abuse, So very often a victim of abuse won't have really good resources to represent themselves legally. We have a phenomenal team of attorneys. They're able to represent victims. They're so well versed in so many issues that are very specific for the frum community. So knowing how to navigate some of the issues that come up with Basin, knowing how to navigate issues related to custody, etc. So that's our legal department. And the department that I direct, which is the education department, is the department that that tries to do as much education awareness as we can. So really, we want to reach people earlier on before somebody is in a full-blown crisis. Ideally, we want to do more prevention work. We want to educate more members of the community on how to cultivate healthy relationships, how to seek as early support as possible in an abusive relationship or family situation, and of course, how to support others. So, so that's our education department. We go in every year, we go to high schools, we go to college campuses, we do trainings for community leaders, we do general community awareness programs. Over the past year, I'm proud to report that, together with members of our Shalom Task Force staff, as well as a team of education presenters that I supervise, we reached in the last year, so over the course of one academic year, we reached 8,000 individuals through our educational programs.
It's a great, and it's very easy to hear. It's a hard topic, but it's presented in a very friendly way around a hard topic. So I really do appreciate what you're doing for the community. And I'm so glad that you're here to talk to our community tonight about what we can do as community members for other people, whether it's in the community and or our loved ones. So I want to talk to some of the different situations. And if you want the recording of what is abuse, it's on our website at adai.org/ and you'll find it right there, adai.org/past-events, and you can find it over there. But let's talk a little bit about what to do if you suspect something is going on for someone that you don't yet fully know. And I want to talk a lot about what not to do and what to do, but let's start with what not to do.
Okay, so start with, I think before we even talk about what not to do or what to do, if it's okay, Deborah, I want to share, as I was preparing this and as I was thinking about support and in my life, what has, trying to put myself back in this mind frame of what feels supportive, what is supportive to somebody else. I was thinking about an experience that I had in my life, if it's okay just for me to share and kind of, to what we're discussing. So about 10 and a half years ago, I was working as a clinician in Flatbush in Brooklyn, at an office there, treating clients. And I left my office in the evening, very busy area, corner of Coney Island and Kings Highway, maybe like that, right there, that neighborhood. And I was walking to my car, and I stopped and saw a coworker of mine on the sidewalk. So I stopped, and we were speaking for a couple of minutes. And I took a step backwards to say goodbye, to say goodnight. And I actually stepped backwards into a sidewalk vault. So, I mean, now you live in the Five Towns, but yeah, you spend a lot of time in the city. And I'm sure you're familiar with, with the sidewalk vaults. Those are the grates that typically are closed on a sidewalk. And they're typically outside of restaurants in Manhattan and Brooklyn. And if they're open, then there's an underground basement, basically under the sidewalk, where restaurants often will store, storage. So it was open. I didn't see it. I took a step backwards, again on the sidewalk, fell backwards 10 feet backwards, straight down onto, onto cement, and I was unconscious. My friend, this coworker of mine, a very close friend of mine, saw everything. She watched it all. To this day, she is still, of the two of us, she is for sure more traumatized as the bystander in this situation, seeing this happen, seeing me fall, seeing me hurt, thinking that I might have died, not knowing what was going to happen, being so afraid. She was for sure the more traumatized of the two of us. And, you know, what happened next was that there was a whole flurry of activity. My friend called Hatzalah, and a few of the Hatzalah members showed up to the scene. And I was, I was out, I was unconscious for a bit. But when I woke up, there was a whole team of Hatzalah members, working around me. And I was totally hysterical. I started freaking out. I didn't know exactly what happened, but I knew that I was in a lot of pain, and I knew that something terrible had happened, and I was scared, and they kept telling me, don't move, like stabilize her neck, stabilize her head. And, I knew from watching enough, ER or hospital TV shows, like you don't want to hear that. So I was so scared, and I was sure that I was dying. So I started freaking out, and I kept saying, I need to say Shema, I need to say Shema, I'm dying, I need to say Shema. And most of the Hatzalah guys were kind of just ignoring me because they were busy making sure I was okay and trying to, stabilize me and treat me medically. There was one Hatzalah responder who saw me freaking out and heard me saying again, I need to say Shema, I'm dying, I need to say Shema. And he came over and he crouched down next to me, and he looked me in the face, looked me in the eyes, and he said, hi, my name is Avraham. You're okay. You're not dying. You're totally fine. And I kept saying, no, I'm telling you, I need to say Shema. I'm dying. And he said, you're not dying, but I'll say Shema with you. You want to say Shema? I'll say Shema with you. And he sat there and he said Shema with me, and he was calming me down. And when I think about that incident, I think about how he could have easily fallen into a role of deciding or thinking that what he needs to provide is singularly medical attention, right? There's this person in really bad shape right there medically. That's what he's trained to do. That's what he needs to provide. And he could have stayed really fixated on that kind of support. I think what he did incredibly well was pay attention to what the support that the person was seeking in front of him was. I was asking for somebody to say Shema with me. I was seeking that emotional support, and he was able to provide that. He really took the cues from the person in front of him, and that was the kind of support that he provided. So I think for me, it's helpful to kind of frame support in this way overall. I think that idea really works in general very often for when somebody is in a crisis, when somebody is perhaps in danger, when somebody is in a lot of pain. We can easily fall into this mode of just wanting to rescue them, wanting to help them. We know what's best. We see that they're struggling. We see that they're in danger. We're going to provide the support that we believe they need at that time. But when we stop and we pay attention sometimes to what the person is seeking, what that person is asking for, and we're able to meet them where they're at and provide them that support, I think that sometimes that really elevates the whole supportive framework, and that kind of allowed me at that time to actually kind of calm down. I felt like I had an ally there. I felt supported. I was able to almost like cooperate more instead of just panicking and freaking out. So I think that when we think about what is helpful, it's always, number one, that empowerment response. And sometimes, Devorah, I know we've spoken about how sometimes people are hesitant to call the Shalom Task Force hotline because they say, aren't you just going to tell me to get divorced? Aren't you going to tell me to leave? Aren't you going to tell me that this person is abusing me and that they're, I deserve better? Aren't you going to tell me? And the truth is, on the Shalom Task Force hotline, we're not telling anybody any of these things. We're not telling somebody something because we're asking, right? When somebody calls the hotline, we're asking the person. We're always operating with this empowerment kind of framework of asking the person, how can I help you? You know your situation best. Help us help you. What is it that you're looking for? Are you looking for, do you want us to just listen? Would you like a referral? How do you think we can be helpful? What kind of referral do you want? So it really always starts with that kind of empowerment and question asking. I noticed, did somebody have a question, Deborah? Did you notice?
We'll look at the questions soon.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so we really start with that, and I'm sure that you find in your work as well that that approaching somebody with a attitude of respect and of empowerment is transformative, right? It's so much more, when we think about the definition of domestic violence or domestic abuse, we talk about the power and control that's at the crux of that relationship dynamic, right? It's always one partner looking to gain and maintain power and control over their partner. And they'll use so many different tactics of abuse to do so, but it's really about the power and control. So if we, as the supporters in that situation, if we find ourselves also telling the person what to do, or demanding that they just leave, or judging them, wondering, well, why don't you just, get out? Why are you, staying in this abusive situation? We're also then operating from this similar kind of place of power and control, of becoming another controlling force in that person's life. So of course that will be ineffective, and of course it will go against the grain of what we want to do, which is help strengthen the person, empower them, elevate them, help them, help us to be supportive in that situation. So we start with that.
Okay, so now we have an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about support, and a little bit of what not to do. But if we're in the situation where we hear a neighbor screaming all the time, what should we do? What should we not do? And what is even Shalom Task Force, if you call Shalom Task Force, what might they be? I think it's very important, as you mentioned, to get ideas of what you can do. But let's just talk about in general, to a more general idea. But Shalom Task Force can help with the more specifics. Go ahead. Yeah,
sure. Okay, so first and foremost, we need to think about safety, and sometimes that idea is overlooked, because sometimes it can feel a little counterintuitive, right? If we think that somebody's in danger, if we hear that somebody's being shouted at or cursed at, if maybe even we witness or hear violence, so we immediately and naturally, we feel protective of the person. We assume that they're in danger, we need to rescue them, we need to help them. So it's sometimes counterintuitive to recognize that the person might be at greater risk with outside intervention at that time, right? If we intervene, if we get involved, that might put that person at a greater risk of danger. So safety planning is always really, really important. And also recognizing, sometimes people, statistically, when a victim of abuse actually starts the process of leaving the relationship, that's historically the most dangerous stage of that relationship. Like for that person, that's the most dangerous time period for them. The highest rate of homicides occur during that stage. So that tells us how important safety is. And certainly if the perpetrator, the abusive partner in that situation, senses or is concerned that a partner might be starting to leave a situation or might be aided by somebody else, that might actually set them off, and that might put them at greater risk. So we do we're always, always when somebody's calling the hotline, we're doing some level of safety assessment. And knowing how to do a safety plan, it's a specific form of response. So, and I encourage people that actually, if somebody wants to learn and wants to be able to familiarize themselves with what exactly is involved in a safety plan, and how to how to kind of think in those terms when they're supporting someone. So calling the Shalom Task Force hotline, we get calls from other individuals who are looking to support the person. Please call the hotline, reach out to the hotline, figure out how you can start to think about safety for that person and how you can think about, formulating some kind of a safe response. So that's first and foremost, really, is safety.
So not knocking on the door and saying, what is going on here?
So it might mean, and again, like I wouldn't create really clear, clear guidelines or like a list of do this, don't do that. It's more of like an attitude, because every situation can be so different, right? And without really knowing the players involved, the actors involved, it's very hard to kind of make this like blanket statement and say, do this, knock on the door, say that, don't do that. There certainly is a formula to general, response and attitude. I would say that, and by the way, I checked right before the webinar just to make sure that this resource is up there. But a few years ago, I compiled the Shalom Task Force Domestic Abuse Awareness Guide. And if you go to our website, shalomtaskforce.org, it's under resources. It's the first guide that's listed under resources. And it's, again, called the Shalom Task Force Domestic Abuse Awareness Guide. And there's a whole list of, in general, kind of responses and attitudes. I created a list of kind of even specific language of what to say, statements of support, what could be helpful to say, some questions to ask. So all of that is listed there. In terms of applying it, that's where it's a little bit more complicated. That's where I would say calling the Shalom Task Force hotline, it will be more helpful to figure out for a specific situation how to apply it. Does that make sense?
I think that's good. I think that's really important, is like right before you go in to do something, is like kind of maybe, get the hand holding from Sheldon Task Force, read that list, like get yourself into the mind space that you're going to be humble and be there in service of them, not just to let out your outrage about what's going on.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I think that, like what you're mentioning is kind of this idea of, let's say it's a neighbor, right? I'm just using, let's say, from your example of knocking on the door. If it's a neighbor, I think that there are certainly ways for a neighbor to show up for that person and to show support. I don't know if like knocking at that door at that time would be the most supportive response. I think that if there's a relationship there. So let's say utilizing some of these different approaches that we talk about, believe the person, validate them, ask questions that are not like what you had said, Deborah, not when we spoke a couple weeks ago, not about prying, not about being nosy, not asking questions because, we're curious or we're interested, asking maybe pointed, specific questions. So from a stance of being most helpful, asking questions that you might be able to then be able to get the support for the person that they need, or you might be able to, redirect them, let's say, to another source of support. So really asking very specific questions. But I want to get back to the first thing that I had said about really believing the person. And I think that even though this can sound simplistic, it's really a message that as a community, we have to repeat and repeat and repeat, because unfortunately, and I think sometimes very just naturally, there's sometimes this feeling of disbelief if we find ourselves in a situation where somebody is, let's say, disclosing, somebody is sharing with you what's going on in their relationship, or even if you suspect that something is going on, whatever, believe the person is so integral, because it's very easy to fall into a trap of thinking, oh, well, you're telling me this, but, you're not the perfect person either, right? Or I just can't believe it about this person. He's the most friendly guy, he's the nicest guy. Or, I can't believe that you're saying this about this woman because, she's such a tzaddik guest, she's always doing chesed for people. And I'm using now interchangeably the two different gender because of course we know that, abuse affects everyone. Men can be victims, women can be victims. So of course we always want to believe everyone, and we don't want to fall into a trap of thinking of being skeptical, and I think also I try to, sometimes I noticed that when I've done leadership trainings for, let's say, kala teachers or mikvah attendants or, rabbanim, rebbitzins, I think sometimes leaders, because they often do find themselves in a position of needing to assess the situation. So very often I'll get a hand or a question of somebody saying, yeah, but what if the person is doing this because they want attention? What if the person, what if they're saying this because they're trying to keep their kids from seeing the, ex-husband? What if they're making it? And I think that in general, we have to move away from setting ourselves up as being the judge and jury in the situation. The person who's an abuse victim will have many situations, especially if they're navigating legal situations. They'll have many situations already where they need to need to be grilled, they need to be interrogated. There are so many different aspects of their life where they already are playing this reel in their head of, will people believe me? What if they think that it's my fault? What if I look like a nebuch? What if I look, disheveled, and everybody sees my husband and he's this upstanding, askan in the community? What if nobody believes me? So we never ever want to fall into a trap of also potentially being another source of judgment for this person. We want to believe the person first and foremost.
I think especially when it's early in their journey and they haven't really been believed yet. So then if you don't believe them, it might set them back a few months, a few years even. So it's really important. Just
for sure. Very often with victims of abuse. I know I was speaking with somebody recently who was talking about their first time disclosing that their child sexual abuse, that they had been molested. And they shared that more than the damage of the actual abuse and how traumatic that was for them, they remember so clearly the first time they disclosed, to the first person they disclosed to in their life, who they went to for support, and the fact that the person really didn't believe them, and how traumatic that was. Even more, what they said in their words was that it was even more traumatic than the actual abuse that had been inflicted on them. So we know that, that the disclosure experience is so important, and showing up and believing the person, and not just believing them with reservation, but actually expressing. And that's the next piece, is validating, acknowledging, saying, I believe you, I'm here for you. I'm so sorry that you're going through this, or I'm so sorry you went through this. How can I help you? Really articulating that. And again, I put down those statements in the guide, and that's language that we should all as a community be familiar with, and be able to have almost like on our the tip of our tongue if we're in a situation where somebody is sharing that they're going through some kind of a painful situation like this.
Yeah. So one of the things that we think about is when someone shares and we want that they're kind of hinting to something and we're not sure what they're saying. So how do you not pry, but probe to see if they're really going there and they just want one more question, or they really don't want to go there, or they're feeling you out, sort of.
Yeah, so, and I think that in a situation like that, I really, it's almost like a dance of almost trying to kind of respond to them by taking the cues that they're putting forth. So I think that even figuring out a way to kind of ask them, is there something more you want to tell me here? Is there, do you want to set up a time for us to speak? And I think, again, thinking about safety and thinking about privacy is really important, right? Sometimes, part of a safety plan might entail having almost like a hint or a safe word with a neighbor, that if I knock on your door and ask if I could borrow some sugar, that might mean, if I knock on your door and, have whatever a code or whatever it is, you might then say, oh yeah, and by the way, is it okay, could I show you the outfit that I just bought for my daughter? It's in the other room, I really want your opinion on it. Because then that person is bringing, you into a private and closed area where you can speak quietly away from the abuser, right? So almost kind of speaking to the person and figuring out if there are ways to set up some kind of a environment, some kind of a way where you have almost this like built-in support and cues and almost hints that the person is then able to support you in a situation where you might need that.
I want to go back to believe her. Sometimes we hear people say, if it was that bad, she wouldn't be staying. She wouldn't still be there. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Right. So, again, unfortunately, there are so many barriers to a person, to a victim of abuse coming forward. And one of the barriers, as we're discussing, is the fear of maybe not being believed, the fear of being judged, the fear that there's going to be this embarrassment now, the shanda of people talking about the marriage, about the family, and so many other barriers. When we just to kind of list quickly some of the barriers that victims of abuse face coming forward is pressure is involved with society, with community, shidduchim. So let's say, for example, pressures with community, there even might be this fear of losing a sense of belonging or status in the community. What might it mean now to be seen as somebody who's in a abusive marriage or relationship? What might it feel like to be seen as somebody who's in a broken home? What might it feel like to show up to a simcha alone without having a spouse? Shidduchim, we think about shidduchim. I mean, there's so much charge around shidduchim as being, the credibility almost for a person and their children. Wanting, being successful in the frum community, unfortunately, so often revolves around the shidduchim, right? So if somebody thinks that that if they disclose what's going on, or coming forward might negatively affect their own shidduch, their siblings' shidduchim, their children's shidduchim, that might keep them in that abusive relationship. They might be afraid to come forward. Finances, very often somebody might find themselves an abuse victim, might be very restricted financially. That might be one of the ways that their partner maintains control over them, is giving them virtually zero or very little access to finances. So coming forward, how will they progress even? So these are just some examples of the different barriers that victims of abuse face coming forward. So asking that question of, but why don't they just leave, or why don't they get help? It really minimizes, and in many ways, it just increases that sense of, of disempowerment that victims of abuse already very often feel. So we really need to move away from that. I also want to just mention, for a moment, I want to make sure that we mention for family members supporting a victim of abuse. I think, in some ways it's similar. Recently, I was speaking with some parents who were about supporting their children through the shidduch process and dating. And for some of these parents were really, really struggling. And certainly for parents or siblings or, close friends of somebody who's in an abusive relationship, it is so counterintuitive to just take a step back, to let that person just kind of, stay in the situation, or to let the person keep every day putting themselves at risk and being so abused and, denigrated by the other person. It's very counterintuitive. But what we find is that for parents, for family members, for loved ones, for friends, it's really important for them to get their own support in the situation, for them to be able to.
The supporter should have support too.
Exactly. Yeah. Because for them to be able to show up, and let's say, for example, the parents who I was speaking to about dating, some of them were saying, but what if my kids, are getting older and they're not being, read any shidduchim, and what if they don't meet someone, and sometimes what we find is that parents, because of their own desperation, their own fear, they'll start, their own judgment will start to become blinded, right? So they might start now pushing their kids to ignore, let's say, red flags of abuse in dating. They might start, encouraging or having their children date someone who other people kind of know to say no to, because that person, maybe was in a previous marriage or has some kind of a history of, abuse, that they are not perhaps the most healthy partner, because parents might be allowing their own anxieties to get in the way, and that's very dangerous. And we find that for sure the same kind of situation, somebody might want to just rush to help their loved one, but it might not be the most helpful approach for that loved one right then. So that person should seek their own support, and that might mean reaching out to a mental health professional, whoever it is that's able to be supportive to them in their life, so that they're able to deal with that issue and make sure they're getting support, so they're able to then compartmentalize and show up for the other person in their life with as much strength as possible. Does that, right?
Yeah. So to add to that, I think that when we're watching someone start to leave and then go back and start to leave and then go back is also very hard. And that's another reason why someone really should get real support for themselves, as being the supporter. Sometimes the supporters, and sometimes the supporter is the only one who's getting the therapy or the counseling. The other one's not ready to get counseling yet.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and that's such a good point, Devorah, the idea of the going back and then getting back together. And, for any of us who've been in a situation of wanting to support someone, when we start becoming over-invested, and I know that Lisa Tversky has spoken about this, and I've heard other people speak about this, the idea of, a helper versus a rescuer. And the rescuer, right, sometimes falls into a trap of overworking, becoming so invested, becoming almost very authoritarian about do this, leave now, get out, don't tolerate this, say this, don't take that, and when we're starting to almost overextend in energy and we feel our energy level becoming so that if the person's going to leave, we feel like, great, now we did everything right, it's all going well. And then let's say the person goes back to their abuser, and now we start to feel like, oh my gosh, we just invested all this energy. They're not listening to us. We care about them. Why aren't they doing this? We're so frustrated. We know that we might be slipping into this kind of approach of being a rescuer instead of being a helper. And the helping model is a model that we're able to kind of, lay claim to our own helping abilities without becoming controlling, without overworking, without overextending, without making it about ourselves too much, instead of being able to kind of keep a boundary up between supporting the other person while also maintaining our own, mental health, our own, feeling of kind of like security, etc.
And to add to that, I've actually dealt with a case where the helper, rescuer, said, "I'm not going to help you anymore if you're not listening to me anyway." And
right.
that shot the relationship and the support, and she slipped back because she was disappointing herself, and she was disappointing her helper.
Right.
And it was not a good place. So
right, exactly, right. And that's very often, right, like that dynamic will play out, that then there's a feeling of not only the person, the victim or survivor, and this terminology is kind of interchangeable, but survivor.
I've heard the terminology, the one who's being hurt.
Yeah, I like that.
It's a very long phrase, but yeah.
Right. But not only is this person already kind of surviving on a daily basis and navigating their abusive situation, and perhaps already navigating so many of their own feelings of shame, self-doubt, anxiety, fear, all of that. But now if they feel like they disappointed the person who was helping them, right? And now the person is upset at them. It just adds even more of that sense of shame and you know, and kind of like just of self loathing, I think, in that situation. And we really want to be careful about that, right? Like we don't, and that's really that idea of kind of making sure to get our own support and not become another source of that. Also, I want to get back to what you're saying about leaving and going back so many times. And we know that statistically, that's very much part of the profile of the domestic abuse scenario, the domestic abuse relationship, where so often the survivors will make multiple attempts to get help or multiple attempts to leave the relationship before they are able to successfully leave, because it's so much part of like that pattern. You know, and sometimes I've heard that statistically a survivor of domestic abuse will make you know, 7 attempts to leave, or sometimes over the course of many years, and that for Orthodox Jewish victims, it's often double that, because some of the barriers that typically survivors of domestic abuse face in the Orthodox Jewish community, there are even more barriers that make it even more complicated for somebody to leave. So we definitely, you know, we want to be aware of that as well.
I want to move a little bit more macro as far as what the community can do in general, and I'm going to now narrow in. But you mentioned shidduchim, and it goes back to why should my kid marry into a family of that? And so, and I'm wondering if you can get to the core of that concern. Will a child who grew up in a domestic abuse situation, will they bring it into their own marriage? And I think that people have a misunderstanding about that, and we can talk to that.
Yeah. So I've had now I've given now so many workshops between high school workshops and college campuses where I've been approached multiple times by someone who is a child coming from an abusive home. And sometimes they'll come over crying and they'll say, this is the home that I come from. You know, I'm thinking specifically of a student at a college campus workshop who came over, you know, and was hysterical and spoke about how, you know, this workshop was so triggering for her because, you know, this was the first time that she actually saw some of these dynamics laid out in an actual workshop. And hearing some of the words and recognizing so many of the features of the home and the father and the parents, you know, and the marriage that she grew up as witness to for so many years. And she, you know, and she was scared and she was crying, and, you know, and she said, and was also fascinating because she also had a tremendous amount of survivor's guilt because now she was dorming at her college campus. And she was very happy. She was a junior. She was, you know, 3rd year of college there. She was doing great. And she said, you know, I'm doing really well, but thinking about how for so many years, that's the home that I came from. And the fact that that's still going on in my home, that's still my parents' marriage, and my younger sister still lives at home. She felt a tremendous amount of survivor's guilt for leaving her younger sister in that situation. You know, and she spoke about how now she's happy. She was actually dating someone, and the relationship was going very well. And she said, and what, you know, but she was feeling sad and fearful about how this might impact her, and that this is the home she came from. You know, and one of the things that we spoke about, I said to her, you know, the truth is some people feel very despondent coming from identifying as somebody who comes from a home that was very abusive. They feel despondent. Sometimes they feel that others see them as just doomed, right? That how could they have a healthy marriage themselves? How could they get a good shidduch, right? If this is the home that they come from. I said, you know, the truth is you had a front row seat for many years. You had a front row seat to a very abusive marriage, a very abusive relationship. And at the same time, you had a front row seat to what you don't want your relationship to look like. And it was very empowering for her, you know, and she actually followed up with me after that. And she told me that she had started She started counseling. She started by reaching out to her college campus counseling department, and she was, going for therapy. And and then there's so many people that I've spoken to about this who they themselves, yes, have been traumatized, perhaps, have come from a home that's abusive. But if they're able to recognize what they do not want to repeat in their relationship, and they're able to see laid out so clearly what they don't want, what it looks like to be victimized, what it might feel like to be victimized, because very often children are also collateral in an abusive marriage and an abusive home. They themselves might also be victims of abuse, of course, either directly or as bystanders. So they're often very clear about what it is that they don't want to repeat. And there's almost a sense of like hypervigilance and urgency that I'm not going to repeat this in my relationship. This is not what my marriage is going to look like. So if they're able to get, correct support, and that's why we go to high schools, right? We want to try to get in as early as possible, not only to teach healthy relationships for people to be able to bring into their own relationships and their own marriage, but for children who are coming from abusive homes, we want them to be able to get the workshop, to be able to identify as, okay, this is what's going on in my home, and I'm going to reach out for help. And so many of these children do, and so many of these students do. They'll reach out, they'll get support, they'll start they'll start therapy. So then they're able to really go into the dating stage and into marriage in some ways more prepared in some ways than children who come from, let's say, homes that, what Shauna always talks about as kind of like maybe good enough marriages, right? And sometimes, there's really, of course, a spectrum, right?
Right.
Some people might be lucky enough to come from homes that their parents have just healthy, amazing marriages. And that's something that they, the modeling that they have, and hopefully they'll bring into their own relationships. But statistically, there are plenty of people and plenty of, children who are coming from homes where marriages are like, they're like, okay, people are like still married, but like barely maybe, or like, going through the motions, or, whatever it is. And so those children might not necessarily be coming into the marriage totally equipped to, they might not have thought so much about what they want in their marriage or don't want, right? Where children who are coming from an abusive home might have. So that's what I like to really encourage parents to be open-minded about who you're willing to have your child date. In general, as a community, I think we need to, just be more open-minded in general about accepting, messiness, right? Like perfection is really not something that exists in any marriage or any relationship. At the same time, I really think people have to be honest about, getting help. So I encourage anybody who is coming from a place of some kind of a trauma, whether it's coming from a domestic abuse background, home, somebody who has experienced any kind of course, abuse, child sexual abuse, or bullying, any kind of trauma, really. I think that dating is a really difficult stage for most people. So many people find dating and shidduchim particularly as very complicated, very complex. So I encourage a lot of people to seek therapy at that time, during dating. But certainly anybody who's coming from a place of trauma to try to get into therapy as soon as possible.
And then for me, most people who have therapy have skills that and awarenesses that people who didn't have therapy have. So I think that they can sort of see whatever it was, the trauma, whatever it was, as a gift almost that got them even better skills than some people.
Right.
But that's saying, just to say I don't want a marriage like my parents, but without doing proactive work, just saying I don't want it is usually not enough.
For sure.
You need to replace skills.
Yes, for sure. Meaning, and that's why I encourage anybody in that situation to seek therapy and to learn some of those skills and to, work through some of their trauma and to recognize what needs to be in place in a healthy relationship. Some of that is done, of course, in a therapeutic framework. We also talk a lot about identifying healthy role models and healthy mentors. and that might not have been it might not have been handed to them by their parents in their home. Those might not be the mentors. That might not be the modeling that they're looking to. But to be able to identify other healthy role models or mentors in their life who they can spend time with, who they can go into their home, who they can look to see, you know, like what positive communication between two spouses looks like. You know, so that's kind of like another, you know, feature that we'll talk about. I also caution against thinking for somebody who's, let's say, dating somebody who's coming from an abusive background, to really be careful. And that's why, again, being in this like mental health framework is really important for that person, because cautioning against trying to rescue the person, or cautioning against, let's say, slipping into the role of being the therapist for that person, because I've seen that happen a lot. You know, where somebody, let's say, who is dating somebody who comes from an abusive background might almost become, you know, in some ways parentified, or almost slip into a role where they're gonna like nurture the person. They're gonna give them everything they didn't get from their home. They're gonna rescue them. You know, and it's kind of that same idea of needing to maintain really healthy boundaries, because that person who came from the abusive background, they need to work through that, but not with their partner serving the role of the parent for them, the therapist to them. That's not a responsibility that that person should shoulder.
Okay, and so some of what you were saying sounds more like for the child of the gender that was hurt. So like, let's just go with the stereotypical, like it sounds like the girl, but some of the guys may not even realize how what their father was doing, how awful it was.
Right.
Sometimes the mother is quieter about it for her reasons, and
right.
He may just model his marriage on his father.
Right, right. Meaning almost identify with the abusive father, see that as, you know, this is how a man operates in his home, or this is right. Right. And look, statistically, you know, I don't want to sugarcoat. Statistically, you know, men who themselves go on to being abusive, there is a higher correlation between them having been, you know, growing up in a home where there was abuse. So we definitely were, you know, we can't turn away from that correlation. Like, that does exist. I just believe strongly, and I, you know, I encourage as a community, you know, parents, people, you know, individuals who are dating, to not to assume that somebody is doomed because of their, you know, background. And for those men, let's say, for example, again, this is really where it's like the community charge of there has to be so much more education earlier on about what healthy marriage is and what needs to be in place in a healthy relationship. And I mean, it shouldn't start in the chassan classes, right? It shouldn't start, the conversation shouldn't be, you know, isolated to a couple of, you know, shiurim classes talking about just, you know, the halachos and the sexuality. Like, we need to talk more about what healthy marriage is, because so that, let's say, some of those men who you're describing, we want them to recognize that even if it's something that's going on in their home, there have to be multiple other sources in their life, whether it's a Rebbe, a Rav, a Mashpia, whoever it is, who's talking a lot about marriage and healthy relationships, so that maybe there's a spark of recognition that, oh, wow, just because my father does that, or just because that's going on, maybe that's not really acceptable. Maybe that's not something that I'm just going to repeat, because I'm hearing this from so many other people that that's actually not a healthy marriage, right? So, you know, that really comes down to, you know, the community involvement, the leadership, the community.
So Avital, we have a couple minutes left. We have so much more to talk about the role of what the community can do. I want to talk to the way that some in the community may treat women who have left. Like, and just in general, divorced women in general, but specifically abuse, like somehow there's some people, for whatever their reasons, treat them like, I don't want my kids to be friends with their kids, or I don't want that woman to be at my Shabbos table. So can you talk to that a little bit? I mean, it's so unfair, but maybe talk to it from a different way.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's such an important point. Yeah, I actually just had this conversation a couple of weeks ago with somebody who was saying that, that after her divorce, she noticed that all of a sudden, like these families and couples and, people who were inviting her kids for play dates, like all of a sudden that stopped. And it was so painful to her, like more than anything else, that was so painful to her that, not only everything she had endured, but now thinking that her children were being victimized, right? And I can't think of anything more painful than that, that for somebody to, and I think that this applies beyond abuse. I think that divorce still is, even though so many more people are getting divorced, like it's so much more common now for sure than a number of years ago, but there is still some stigma associated with that. And if as a community, we start creating these barriers or these like siloed, I don't know, like these like siloed spaces where only people who come from, a married home or children who come from healthy, if that's the only people who are allowed into our community, or children who we can allow our children to associate with, I mean, I really think that honestly, that's the antithesis for sure of Yiddishkeit in general, right? Meaning everything that we're supposed to, like everything that we're supposed to stand for in terms of, chesed and, gomei chasadim, rachmanim, baishanim, like all of that definitely is like the antithesis to that. And I think that really, if we think that we're going to be able to almost protect our children by not allowing messiness or not allowing bad influences to sully their rose-colored glasses of the world, I think that we're probably positioning our kids to not be very thoughtful, kind, or resilient people, right? I think we're kind of setting them up to only be able to operate if the people around them are perfect. So I don't think we're setting them up for success. And I think typically what I find is that people who are pretty secure as parents and feel like they're doing whatever they can, trying hard, doing a good job at teaching their kids good midos, good values, wrong from right, being respectful and kind to other people, I find very often that those parents are much more tolerant and much more like willing to have their children like associate with a kid who like comes from like a divorced home versus parents who I think are very insecure and feel in some ways inadequate about their own parenting and what they're doing for their children. So they think that putting up another barrier and another wall and don't speak to that person and don't play with that kid and don't do that, I find that that's, very often correlated. So, that's.
So as a community, I think that as we can peck away at some of the barriers that hold people in these relationships,
right?
Like you had a list there before, and if we could, and some people are afraid of the future of not being included in the community, their kids being ostracized, their kids, we don't want them in, well, not in our, we don't want them in our yeshiva. We don't want, instead of providing a safe haven for them or a peaceful haven for them, we just throw them to the side because, I don't know why, but because. And I think that if we just pick away at some of those barriers, we'll be doing a big service to the people who are being hurt in these relationships, and they can get out sooner. And if we believe, I think it's, and believe and support and know how to support. I think these are the important things. And I think it's so wonderful that Shalom Task Force has that hotline that people who don't necessarily know yet how to navigate can call and get insight. You don't have to figure it out. There's people who can help you just work through it step by step. And as I understand from our conversations, that people can call the hotline numerous times and get next step information and next step information, and it can always be anonymous.
Right, exactly. Confidential, anonymous, and again, as a safety measure, now being able to also even chat in. So if somebody's in a room and they can't talk out loud, they can or WhatsApp in and be able to speak to a trusted advocate. So we have this resource. And look, I'll just end by saying, I don't think that I don't think that accepting somebody from an abusive background is for everyone. I don't think that everyone might feel like they want to, let's say, take on that kind of family history or background. So it's knowing yourself too, knowing what your tolerance is, knowing what your capabilities are, knowing what your your threshold for like messiness and and like baggage, all of that. But I do think it's really, as you're saying, Deborah, like definitely as a community, feeling a sense of obligation really and responsibility, certainly to children who are coming from abusive homes or divorced homes or homes where there's any kind of really crisis. And I think we do, by the way, an amazing job as a community supporting, people in crisis when it's a crisis that's like more comfortable, right? So somebody who a home that hospital, somebody has cancer and the mother is going for chemo, and in a home where somebody was just in an accident, and a home where I think as a community we are like above and beyond the best, right? And I think that tells us that we have that within us as a community, the fabric of our community. We have a million Beaker Hollands and Tompe Shabbases, and we have that like built in. And I think that we probably can, if we want to, we can draw that up a little bit more and extend it more to supporting, survivors of abuse. And I think we can get there and I think we are actually making great strides as a community. And I think we can continue heading in that direction. Amen.
Thank you so much, Avital. Just why don't you just give the name of the link to your website, shalomtaskforce.org, right?
.org.
I put the number in the chat. I just want to bring that back up, just for those who are listening rather than reading the chat. It's 718-337-3700.
Okay, sorry. Actually, Deborah, that's the old number. Still, I know that when people Google, but no, it's still
on your website.
It still works.
Oh, okay.
But I will say we always give the 888 number. The chat is connected to the 888. So it's 888-883-2323.
I get that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's the confidential anonymous hotline. And people can also text and WhatsApp to that number. Also, if you go to the Shalom Task Force website, shalomtaskforce.org, you can also access, it says live chat, to speak to a live chat representative, click here. So you can also reach the chat line, using that.
Shalom Task Force is only for New York City, or can it be anywhere, everywhere?
No, so we get calls, we receive calls internationally, and we're affiliated and partnered with so many communities across the US. We also have a whole education department actually in Israel as well. And we receive calls from Australia, from Russia. We receive calls internationally. If somebody is calling or chatting in from another area, we are aware of many of the resources in those locations. We've done a thorough analysis of who the providers are in those areas that are either trained to support survivors of domestic abuse or culturally specific from communities. So if you reach out from those different locations, we're able to provide resources there as well. And of course, always first and foremost, providing support. And sometimes people just call, and we encourage anybody to just call, even again, to talk about what's going on or to ask questions. And not everybody is at the point of calling and asking for a referral. We're always providing support as well.
So you can go to the Shalom Task Force website. You can also go to the Adai website. We have resources and articles that we've compiled on the topic of the different aspects, family, children, how to be supportive, different books, just lots of resources that we've compiled as well. So that's at the Adai website. That's adaiad.org. And you'll see lots of other information there as well. So thank you so much, Avital.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you, Shalom Task Force, for hosting us tonight. And and good night, everybody. You can send any questions to us at info@adai.org. Everything is confidential, and we can try to help you in any area with marriage, shidduchim, and anything else like that. So thank you and good night.
Thank you.